Hey guys, tonight we begin with something gently strange, mildly questionable, and entirely Victorian. So if you're settling in, dimming the lights, maybe fixing a blanket just right, this is your moment. We're taking a slow, sleepy drift through the world of Victorian insomnia cures, the soft science, the hard nonsense, and the quietly unhinged middle ground the 19th century loved so much. So breathe in, breathe out, settle in, and let's begin with the Victorians being very Victorian, which is to say, confident, wrong, and wearing too many layers for someone trying to fall asleep. Victorian Britain had a reputation for order, restraint, and polite misery. It was a society where people decorated everything: homes, clothing, moral beliefs, but insomnia was decorating the one thing they couldn't control: their minds. And because Victorians believed nearly every problem was solvable through strict routines, natural remedies, and the occasional dose of arsenic if you were really committed, their approach to sleeplessness followed the same pattern. To understand why they invented such peculiar cures, let's float over to the cultural mood. Sleep wasn't simply sleep. It was a measure of moral worth. Sleeping too much meant laziness. Sleeping too little meant you lacked inner virtue or were burdened by thoughts unsuitable for a respectable Christian. And insomnia? That was practically a character flaw. Of course, this wasn't helped by the fact that the era's favorite pastime was worrying about industrialization, about social class, about other people's ankles being scandalous. Victorians worried so hard they created entire medical subfields to justify the worrying. And insomnia was one of their most fashionable anxieties. In upper-middle households, sleep was status. The more refined you were, the more delicate your nerves became, until merely existing was enough to exhaust you. Doctors called this nervous exhaustion. Insomniacs called it being alive in the 19th century. Physicians blamed it on almost anything: reading too late, emotional overexertion, eating too much, eating too little, working the mind, not working the mind, too much air, not enough air. There was always a cause, just usually the wrong one. The era's star insomnia doctor was George Miller Beard, an American whose ideas Victorians adored. Beard believed that modern life, newspapers, telegrams, trains, had overstimulated people's nervous systems. Essentially, he thought the human brain was a battery that industrialization was slowly draining, leaving everyone too mentally frazzled to sleep. And because Victorians loved pseudoscientific metaphors involving wires, currents, and nerve energies, they embraced this wholeheartedly. Beard's cure? Not the normal kind. No, he prescribed a rest cure, possibly the most ironic treatment for insomnia ever invented. Patients were confined to bed, forbidden from reading, socializing, or thinking too much. Nurses fed them milk, massaged them, and monitored their every move. The logic was simple. If your nerves were fried by modern life, total sensory deprivation would reboot you like a Victorian smartphone. In practice, it mostly made people extremely bored. And if you've ever tried to sleep because you're bored, you know it rarely works. But Victorians were committed to the bit. Some patients were women, especially upper-class ones, because the assumption was that women's nerves were softer, more sensitive, and prone to collapse whenever the plot required. Think of it as medicalized condescension wrapped in velvet drapery. Let's drift over to Joanna, an upper-middle-class housewife from 1874, who followed the rest cure with the earnestness of someone who desperately wanted to be obedient and also desperately wanted a nap. She spent 6 weeks lying in bed while a nurse watched her. She drank milk at set hours because it was believed to fortify the nervous tissue, which is a poetic way of saying no one really knew what milk did. She wasn't allowed to write letters because it might agitate her. And she wasn't allowed to walk more than a few steps because physical activity dispersed nerve force. Did Joanna sleep? Some nights, yes. Most nights, she just lay there thinking about how much she hated her wallpaper. But milk wasn't the only cure floating around. Oh no. Victorians had shelves of sleep remedies ranging from herbal to mildly toxic to, why is this legal? Let's look at one favorite, chloral hydrate. It was marketed as a gentle, soothing sleep draft, but it was essentially the 19th century version of knocking yourself unconscious with chemistry. Doctors loved it. Pharmacists loved it. Insomniacs absolutely loved it, and everyone quietly ignored that it could cause dependency, hallucinations, and liver damage. In small doses, it worked. In larger doses? Well, it also worked, just more permanently. But the Victorians weren't always so intense. Some cures were surprisingly soft, borderline cozy. One popular method was air bathing, which involved opening a window and letting the cold night air circulate around your bedroom. Supposedly, fresh air calmed the nerves. Of course, most Victorian cities also filled that air with coal dust, cigarette smoke, and factory fumes. But details. Another gentle method was soaking the feet in warm water. This sounds normal enough until you reach the part of the instructions recommending mustard powder, vinegar, lavender oil, or, if you were fancy, rose petals. The idea was that drawing blood downward eased the mind. Victorian medicine loved the concept of bodily fluids having directional preferences. Sleep was apparently a negotiation between your brain and your toes. Some elite households even had sleep rooms, little chambers designed for the perfect night's rest. They featured blackout curtains, heavy carpets to muffle sound, and furniture draped in thick fabrics to prevent the noise of wooden surfaces clattering. These rooms were meant to soothe overstimulated minds. They did not, however, address the actual problem. People were overstimulated because factories ran 24/7, trains screamed through cities, and gas lamps flickered ominously all night like they were haunted by an indecisive ghost. Still, it was a vibe. But perhaps the most Victorian cure of all was moral regulation. Some doctors believed insomnia was caused by guilt. If you sinned too much, or, frankly, thought about sinning too much, your conscience kept you awake. So the prescription became staying virtuous. This included avoiding spicy foods, stimulating books, or immoderate imaginings, which is a very Victorian way of saying, don't think too hard about anything fun. Queen Victoria herself had opinions on sleep. She believed early hours were best and once wrote that staying up late was unwholesome to the Constitution. Meanwhile, her son Albert Edward, better known as Bertie, believed staying up late was essential because that was when the champagne came out. Bertie was insomniac adjacent, but mostly because he refused to go to bed before 2 or 3 in the morning. His mother did not appreciate this. Their family dynamic could be summarized as Victoria lecturing about discipline and Bertie trying to live a semi-respectable party boy lifestyle while being chronically exhausted. He would later become King Edward VII, a monarch known for charm, waistcoats, and a sleep schedule that any modern college student would envy. But beyond the royals and the social climbers, ordinary Victorians had their own nighttime remedies. Many working-class families boiled hops, the same plant used in beer, and stuffed them into little pillows. Hops give off a calming aroma, and people believed sleeping on them lulled the mind. This was one of the few cures that actually had mild evidence behind it. But because it was cheap, it never gained the prestige that wealthy households preferred. If a cure couldn't be expensive, time-consuming, or mildly dangerous, upper society wasn't interested. There was also valerian root tea, known for its strongly earthy smell, often described as somewhere between old socks and slightly expired chocolate. Victorians insisted that if your tea smelled like the inside of a forgotten drawer, it must be medicinal. Some people swore it relaxed the nerves. Others swore it tasted like damp soil. Both were correct. Meanwhile, scientists, the real ones, not the "my nerves are electric wires" ones, were tentatively studying sleep. But the field was still young. The only certainty was that people didn't sleep enough and they worried about not sleeping enough, which ironically made them sleep even less. So doctors invented explanations, each more poetic than scientific. One theory claimed that the brain heated during thinking, and insomnia occurred because the mind stayed too warm. The cure was cooling the forehead with a damp cloth. This wasn't entirely wrong. Bodies do regulate temperature during sleep, but Victorians took it to extremes. Some people slept with metal plates beside their beds to chill the air. Others dipped their pillows in cold water. One enthusiastic gentleman reportedly slept with his head inside a brass bowl filled with ice water, which must have been exactly as comfortable as it sounds. Then there were the Victorian sleep coaches, individuals who sold customized advice on maintaining purity of mind, posture, diet, breath, and even clothing. They claimed tight corsets obstructed sleep by restricting lung motion. This was true. They also claimed that loose clothing allowed night vapors to penetrate the skin and disturb dreams. This was not true, but it did lead to some interesting nighttime fashion choices. Despite the quackery, many cures overlapped with modern recommendations. Dim lights, quiet rooms, cool air, herbal teas, regular routines. But the Victorians couldn't resist adding dramatic flair, usually involving the word nerves at least 8 times. And that brings us to the softest science of all, Victorian bedtime routines. People believed that winding down the mind was an art form. You were supposed to avoid stimulating conversations after dinner. You weren't meant to argue, read Dickens, practice piano, or think about your taxes. Instead, you should contemplate nature, pray, or sit quietly while drinking warm milk, preferably from a silver cup because, again, status. Some people wrote in diaries as a way to purge stressful thoughts, though doctors warned against emotional writing because it heated the nerves. Other people took long, slow walks through their gardens. And some simply stared at the fireplace until the flames did that hypnotic Victorian flickering thing that made you question your life choices. Lord Henry Somerton was the kind of Victorian aristocrat whose entire personality revolved around being chronically tired and quietly dramatic about it. He wasn't ill. He wasn't overworked. He simply had insomnia of the most Victorian variety, the type brought on by too much social expectation, too many dinner parties, and a spirit weakened by the heavy burden of owning 12 waistcoats. Somerton lived in a tall London townhouse with more curtains than open windows and more obligations than interests. His household functioned like a well-trained musical ensemble, except the entire orchestra was trying to tiptoe around his nightly frustrations. He believed his insomnia came from excessive mental excitation, which sounded noble, but mostly meant he stayed up reading newspapers and complaining about Parliament until 2 in the morning. His wife, Lady Eleanor, was patient, but in the Victorian sense of the word, meaning she quietly seethed in a dignified way while pretending to embroider flowers she didn't care about. She claimed Henry's insomnia was punishment for ignoring her suggestions about retiring earlier. He claimed her suggestions were the reason he couldn't rest, because nothing disturbs a man's mind like advice he does not wish to receive. Their marriage was essentially a duet of polite bickering performed over chamomile tea. Somerton tried every fashionable cure. First came the mustard foot bath, 18 minutes of sitting with dignity while his valet poured warm water and bright yellow powder into an ornate porcelain basin. Henry insisted it worked because his feet tingled, and tingling felt close enough to therapeutic to satisfy him. But it didn't help him fall asleep. It only made his feet smell faintly like a sandwich. Next came the sleeping draughts. His doctor, a respectable man named Dr. Fuller, believed that insomnia was a sign of excess cerebral pressure, which Somerton interpreted as having a brain too refined for rest. Fuller prescribed chloral hydrate in small quantities. Henry took it in slightly larger quantities because he believed the faster a remedy worked, the better it was. Predictably, this led to one startling incident in which he fell asleep halfway through a conversation with a visiting bishop and briefly convinced everyone he had died. Eleanor made him stop taking chloral hydrate after that. She did not wish to host any more near funerals at the breakfast table. Instead, she encouraged him to follow the softer methods: air bathing, gentle stretching, reading dull books. But Henry had a talent for turning the simplest cure into a philosophical crisis. When instructed to rest in a quiet room for an hour before bed, he interpreted it as lying completely still on a chaise longue, hands folded like he was preparing for an artistic death scene. Whenever someone entered to check on him, he opened his eyes in a slow, dramatic blink, as though awakening from centuries of enchanted slumber. Victorians had a flair for theatricality, but Henry Somerton took it as a sport. Across the household, the servants developed their own theories about his sleeplessness. Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper, believed Lord Somerton's nerves were strained from eating too many anchovies, which she considered sinful in both flavor and texture. Mr. Harrow, the butler, believed his lordship simply thought too much about politics, something he claimed no good could ever come from. and the scullery maid believed he was cursed because she once saw him walk upstairs without touching the railing, which she felt was unnatural for a mortal man. Rumors aside, Henry's insomnia influenced everything in the household, right down to the dog, an old spaniel named Molly, who slept more soundly than her master and often sighed whenever he paced at night. Even the dog seemed exhausted by him. Somerton's preferred cure of the month became sleep tonics of botanical extraction. This was Victorian code for herbal concoctions created by someone with more enthusiasm than scientific training. His favorite was a mixture of valerian, hops, and something called essence of calm, which sounded suspiciously like flavored water. The tonic tasted, according to Henry, like if a meadow had regrets. But he drank it anyway, because Victorians loved suffering with purpose. Lady Eleanor tried to be supportive. She read medical pamphlets out loud to him in the evenings. She brewed gentle teas. She even encouraged him to keep a nightly journal so he could release his mind of its burdens. Henry wrote exactly 3 entries before declaring journaling too stressful because it forced him to confront his thoughts, which he found impertinent and unruly. His handwriting, already dramatic, became utterly illegible whenever he was tired. One journal entry simply said, "Wednesday. Cannot sleep. The lamps judge me." But the Somerton household's favorite cure was the midnight constitutional, a slow walk taken through the garden under the dim blue of a London night. Henry believed the air at midnight was purer, which would surprise anyone who has ever inhaled 19th century industrial fumes. He paced among the rose bushes with great purpose, analyzing the shape of the moon and muttering to himself about destiny, civility, and how his cousin had insulted him 12 years earlier by remarking that Henry looked well-rested. Sometimes Eleanor joined him. They strolled together as if starring in a sleepy, mildly disgruntled opera. Though the walks rarely helped Henry sleep, they gave the servants something to whisper about, which was entertainment enough. But the most elaborate cure came from Dr. Fuller himself, who recommended a complete bedroom redesign to promote restfulness. Essentially, a Victorian sleep consultant. The doctor insisted that Henry's wallpaper pattern, a busy swirl of florals and vines, overstimulated the brain. Eleanor liked the wallpaper. Henry pretended he didn't care but later admitted that he felt judged by the vines, which was one of his more iconic statements. They replaced the wallpaper with a calmer design, pale green stripes. They installed heavy curtains to block out the moonlight, which Somerton claimed gazed too harshly upon him. They added a thick carpet to dampen sound, though the carpet mostly dampened Molly the spaniel, who became nearly invisible when she lay down. Dr. Fuller insisted on fresh lavender bundles tied with blue ribbon and placed in precise locations around the room. Henry found the scent soothing for exactly 1 week before declaring it oppressively floral. Victorians were committed to having opinions about smells. He also installed one of the era's strangest innovations, a bed-tilting device meant to raise the sleeper's head slightly because some physicians believed a modest incline improved dream quality. Somerton adored the mechanism. He felt it made him look medically important. Eleanor thought it made him look like a decorative statue. Despite everything, the herbs, the fresh air, the fancy bed, the quiet routines, Henry continued to struggle with sleep. Not dramatically. Not dangerously, just persistently, a steady, lingering inability to relax. Finally, in a rare moment of self-awareness, he wondered whether his insomnia came from his lifestyle. Too much rich food, too many social commitments, too much time spent trying to impress people he secretly disliked. This was a promising line of thought, but Henry abandoned it the moment it made him uncomfortable. Instead, he returned to his favorite explanation: I simply possess a sensitive constitution. A perfect Victorian conclusion. Still, something unusual happened that winter. A slow shift. Eleanor noticed that Henry's sleep improved slightly when he had predictable evenings. Not dramatic improvements, just a little more stillness, a little less pacing. When dinner was early, when the house was quiet, when he didn't read newspapers right before bed, Henry sometimes drifted off naturally. This annoyed him. He preferred dramatic cures. Natural sleep felt lackluster, as if he hadn't earned it. Yet the pattern continued. Some nights, after a warm footbath and a tedious book, he grew drowsy. Once, he fell asleep mid-sentence while lecturing Eleanor about something forgettable. She didn't correct him. She simply tucked the blanket around him and enjoyed the silence. Henry's improvement did not go unnoticed. Servants said his face looked less stormy. Molly the spaniel barked at him less. Even Dr. Fuller felt compelled to congratulate himself as if he had personally invented basic bedtime routine. Of course, the progress didn't last. Victorians were notoriously inconsistent about their health habits. After 3 weeks of gentle improvement, Henry attended a late-night musical soiree where he drank too much punch, argued about agricultural policy, and returned home at 2 in the morning with the emotional energy of a caffeinated owl. Naturally, he didn't sleep again for days. But this was the rhythm of Victorian insomnia. Small improvements overshadowed by lifestyle, tempered by social expectation, reinforced by questionable medical advice. Dr. Augustus Fenwick was a man who loved 2 things with astonishing intensity: medical theories and being correct. Unfortunately for the Victorian public, he was only truly good at one of those, and it was not the one involving accuracy. Fenwick built an entire medical reputation on insomnia, nervously hovering between genuine curiosity and the kind of confidence that only comes from never doubting yourself for even a single minute. He was tall in the way Victorian men liked to be described, distinguished, which meant slightly gaunt, dramatically bony, and always looking as though he was recovering from a recent emotional revelation. His hair was perpetually disheveled from his habit of running his hands through it whenever a patient said something he found medically offensive, such as, "I slept well last night." Fenwick believed that sleep was the final frontier of medical science. The problem was that he also believed he already understood it. He wrote pamphlets. He gave lectures. He administered treatments that ranged from mildly comforting to deeply puzzling. And to his credit, he cared about his patients. He just also cared about being important. His most famous lecture, delivered in London in 1878, was titled The Tyranny of Wakefulness, a treatise on nervous dysregulation. The audience adored it, not because it made sense, it really didn't, but because Fenwick had a talent for speaking in long, soothing sentences that sounded intelligent even when they weren't. He used phrases like the quivering architecture of the mind and the soft machinery of repose, both of which meant nothing but were delivered with persuasive gravitas. Fenwick's theory of insomnia rested on one concept: nerve drainage. He argued that the nervous system collected stimulus residue throughout the day, and if that residue wasn't released properly, it clogged the mind and prevented sleep. What released it? According to Fenwick, quiet contemplation, moderate exercise, and his personal line of medicinal tonics, coincidentally available for sale after every lecture. His patients adored him. They felt understood, or at least pleasantly comforted by his encyclopedic vocabulary. He visited homes. He performed examinations. He tapped lightly on people's foreheads with his fingertips as though communicating directly with their nerve centers. No one was sure what this accomplished, but it looked impressive. Among Fenwick's more devoted followers was a gentle widow named Mrs. Sylvia Westmere, a polite woman with chronic sleeplessness and a habit of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She had suffered insomnia since her husband's death, and Fenwick believed she had an accumulation of emotional electricity. His cure involved long conversations, herbal infusions, and weekly visits during which he asked her to describe her dreams in excruciating detail. Mrs. Westmere later admitted she didn't actually remember most of her dreams but felt pressured to invent them so Fenwick wouldn't be disappointed. She once described dreaming of a large, calming waterfall, which was entirely fabricated, but the doctor responded with such enthusiasm, explaining how waterfalls metaphorically cleansed the nervous system, that she quietly added waterfalls to all future invented dreams for consistency. Fenwick treated people from every social background, from overworked factory clerks to aristocrats who had never done anything strenuous except exist. But his most celebrated patient was Lady Celia Norwood, a woman renowned for her beauty, her sharp opinions, and her frighteningly generous use of perfume. Celia suffered from social overstimulation, which meant she went to too many parties and then had trouble sleeping afterward. Fenwick adored treating her, not because she needed help. She mostly needed less champagne, but because she was influential. If Lady Celia endorsed a remedy, it became instantly fashionable. Soon half of London's upper class was swearing by nerve drainage exercises, which consisted of lying on the floor with one hand over the stomach and the other extended dramatically toward the ceiling, like a fainting ghost practicing ballet. Fenwick conducted these sessions in his private clinic, a dimly lit suite decorated with heavy curtains, dark mahogany furniture, and framed anatomical drawings that were simultaneously educational and unsettling. He burned lavender incense constantly, claiming it stabilized the nerve currents, though many patients complained it made their eyes water. He kept extensive notes, not on actual symptoms, but on metaphors he planned to use in future lectures. Pages and pages of phrases like mental quietude, the somber tide of rest, and the moonlit rhythm of the exhausted soul. Fenwick believed the key to medical authority was sounding poetic enough that patients wouldn't question anything. His crowning achievement was the invention of the somnoregulator, a device that looked like a cross between a stethoscope, a fishing reel, and an early telephone. Patients sat in a chair while Fenwick placed 2 metal pads on either side of their temples. He then turned a small crank, producing a soft hum that supposedly tuned the mind to the frequency of repose. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it was relaxing in the same way wind chimes or distant machinery can be relaxing, just enough to convince a patient they felt calmer. Fenwick's most devoted patients claimed that after sessions with the somnoregulator, they slept with the serenity of a saint, though it is equally possible they were simply tired from sitting still for 40 minutes. But Fenwick's influence wasn't limited to London. He traveled. He lectured. He even published a short book called Recollections of the Restless Mind, which was mostly rambling essays about the importance of proper posture and dietary moderation. The book sold well because Victorians adored anything that promised self-improvement with maximum seriousness and minimal effort. His ideas spread across the empire. Colonial administrators who lived in hot climates blamed the weather for their insomnia. Fenwick insisted it was their internal vibratory imbalance. Missionaries wrote to him requesting advice for treating sleeplessness among their congregations. Fenwick replied with long letters explaining that restlessness was a symptom of spiritual overstimulation, which was his polite way of saying he had no idea. In many ways, Fenwick embodied the Victorian medical spirit, earnest, ambitious, and deeply incorrect in ways that were too polite to be dangerous but too confident to be dismissed. Yet despite his elaborate theories, Fenwick himself suffered from insomnia. Not dramatically, not continually, but consistently enough to be noticeable. His colleagues whispered that he was far too excitable. His publisher hinted that he drank too much black tea. His maid, who witnessed his habits firsthand, insisted he had the sleep patterns of a bat. Fenwick refused to acknowledge this. Whenever asked about his own rest, he claimed he simply required less sleep than ordinary men because of his vigorous intellectual constitution. In reality, he stayed up until midnight reading medical journals and then lay awake fretting about the quality of his metaphors. Once, during a session with Lady Celia, he actually fell asleep for a few seconds while explaining the somnoregulator. She didn't notice. She was too busy admiring her own reflection in a hand mirror, but the moment haunted Fenwick for weeks. His personal cure for insomnia involved pacing. He paced across his study. He paced while dictating letters. He paced while practicing new lecture lines in front of a tall mirror, occasionally saying "excellent" to himself with great satisfaction. Pacing helped him think. It did not help him sleep. Eventually, Fenwick tried one of his own remedies, an herbal tonic he designed with the confidence of a man who believed that plants had personalities. It contained valerian, chamomile, orange blossom, and a pinch of something labeled Fenwick's proprietary essence. His assistants believed the essence was just honey. Fenwick insisted it was the distilled spirit of calm, extracted through a process that sounded suspiciously like boiling things until they dissolved. He drank the tonic nightly. It helped a little. enough that he could fall asleep after an hour of dramatic fretting instead of 2. But Fenwick's true legacy wasn't the somnoregulator or his questionable herbal mixtures. It was something subtler. He made insomnia fashionable. Before him, sleeplessness was seen as a flaw, a weakness, a sign of emotional fragility. But under Fenwick's influence, insomnia became a mark of refinement, a sign that your mind was too active, too sensitive, too delicate for ordinary earthly rest. Aristocrats began to claim insomnia as casually as they claimed migraines, another Victorian badge of moral superiority. People scheduled rest consultations because it gave them an air of importance. Housewives began blaming household misfortunes on nerve tension rather than their husbands' habits of leaving doors open. Fenwick's theories, however flawed, gave the Victorian public a way to understand their own anxieties. The Industrial Revolution had filled their lives with noise, smoke, deadlines, and existential dread. But Fenwick framed sleeplessness not as a symptom of stress but as evidence of a sophisticated mind struggling to adapt to a modern world. His influence quietly shaped an entire era's understanding of rest. And though his cures were often ineffective or unnecessary, his voice, calm, poetic, and endlessly self-assured, helped people feel less alone in their wakefulness. Fenwick died many years later, peacefully in his sleep. His patients insisted this was proof that he had finally mastered the art of rest. His critics said it was coincidence, and his maid maintained that he simply exhausted himself by talking too much. Whatever the truth, his era drifted onward, carrying his ideas like faint echoes through drawing rooms, medical journals, and late-night conversations among the sleepless. And as we leave Dr. Fenwick's quietly humming clinic behind, let's float over to another Victorian figure whose relationship with insomnia was far stranger, someone whose nighttime rituals bordered on theatrical performance. Chapter 4. The Nocturnal Theatrics of Lady Margaret Renshaw. Lady Margaret Renshaw was the sort of Victorian aristocrat who treated insomnia not as a medical nuisance, but as a performance art. She didn't merely fail to sleep, she orchestrated the entire night with delicate gestures, faint sighs, and the occasional dramatic glance toward the moon. Her household staff, already trained in patience, learned early that a night in Lady Margaret's company required the stamina of a minor army and the tact of a diplomat. Margaret inherited her insomnia from a family famous for both refinement and nervous fragility. Cousins, aunts, and uncles all reported waking at odd hours, wandering about with teacups, or reading dull pamphlets in the middle of the night. Her father, a solemn man with a penchant for counting floorboards, once tried to cure the family by establishing an hourly, silent reflection period after dinner. It failed, predictably, because nobody could remember what silent reflection meant, and they all nodded politely until the designated time was up. Margaret's nights were divided into distinct rituals, each more theatrical than the last. She began by lighting a small lamp beside her bed, adjusting it to cast shadows on the wall just so. These shadows were carefully observed, because Margaret believed the proper arrangement of shapes could soothe overstimulated perception. To her, misaligned shadows were responsible for restless dreams, though staff suspected it was more about having an excuse for precise lamp placement. After lamp adjustments came the herbal preparation stage. Lady Margaret insisted on a combination of chamomile, lemon balm, and hops, carefully steeped for exactly 7 minutes. Any variation was unacceptable. Once, her maid accidentally steeped the mixture for 6.5 minutes. Margaret detected the error within moments, declaring the tea insufficiently attuned to the somnolent frequencies. The maid spent the remainder of the evening quietly apologizing, while Margaret sipped her corrected infusion and whispered to herself about the cruelty of imperfection. Once the tea was consumed, Margaret reclined gracefully on her chaise longue, taking care that her posture resembled a delicate swan at rest. Her evening journal lay nearby, but she seldom wrote. Writing was only performed when she felt an emotional tremor worthy of documentation. A quarrel with her hairdresser, a particularly judgmental glance from her cousin, or a disagreement over the proper placement of silverware at dinner. Otherwise, the journal remained untouched, like an ornamental accessory reinforcing her cultivated air of introspection. Margaret also practiced mental decluttering, which involved imagining her thoughts as tiny birds. She would visualize each bird leaving her mind one by one, fluttering out the window. If a bird resisted, she regarded it with mild disapproval until it complied. The method was entirely her own invention, inspired by a half-remembered lecture on nerve regulation and an affinity for pastoral imagery. It had no measurable effect on sleep, but it made her feel purposeful, which was apparently close enough. Her nightly walks were, of course, ceremonial. She moved slowly through the drawing room, occasionally stopping to admire the moonlight on a polished table or the tilt of a painting frame. Staff were instructed to maintain silence, except for the occasional hushed whisper when she required a cushion fluffed or a window adjusted. During these walks, Margaret often engaged in private conversations with the portraits lining the walls, asking advice or venting frustrations. Whether the ancestors responded is unknown, but Margaret seemed satisfied with the imaginary dialogue. If these rituals failed, Margaret had a backup plan: their aromatic intervention. Lavender, rosemary, and occasionally orange blossom were burned in porcelain burners around the bedroom. Margaret claimed that scent alone could lull the mind into repose, though evidence suggested that repeated inhalation mainly caused staff to cough politely and retreat. Nevertheless, Margaret persisted, inhaling deeply and nodding as though each whiff were a small, fragrant victory over the tyranny of wakefulness. Unlike other Victorians, Margaret did not rely on chemical sleep aids. She considered them vulgar. Chloral hydrate, laudanum, even mild tonics were beneath her dignity. Instead, she cultivated insomnia like an art form, a carefully staged ballet of stillness, ritual, and meticulous observation. If she did drift off, it was often by accident, in the middle of a pose or a half-finished herbal meditation, leading to highly ungraceful moments that she interpreted as the body's unplanned surrender to proper rhythm. Interestingly, Margaret's insomnia was socially contagious. Guests visiting her home often found themselves lying awake in her guest bedrooms, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and the soft rustle of her nightly movements. They would nod politely at the concept of somnolent architecture and imagine their own mental birds fluttering out the window. Some claimed to feel calm. Others simply gave up and spent the night wondering whether insomnia was hereditary, fashionable, or inevitable in polite society. Margaret's obsession with sleep extended to her correspondence. Letters arrived weekly from friends and acquaintances describing their own nocturnal struggles. Margaret replied with painstaking attention, recommending precise lamp heights, pillow angles, tea temperatures, and imaginary bird counts. Her handwriting, flowing and deliberate, conveyed a sense of calm purpose that contrasted sharply with the restless energy she channeled nightly. Recipients often felt simultaneously soothed and mildly exhausted, as if participating in a silent sleep ritual without ever leaving their own rooms. Despite these eccentricities, Margaret's insomnia was remarkably gentle. She rarely suffered dramatic breakdowns. Her nights were long but measured. Each stage of her ritual was performed with soft precision, almost like a meditation. Her staff, while occasionally weary, grew accustomed to the quiet choreography. Anne Margaret, in her serene yet slightly theatrical fashion, became a quiet legend among Victorian sleepless elites, someone whose wakefulness was dignified, elaborate, and oddly comforting to those who admired patience performed with flair. Occasionally, however, Margaret's control slipped. One evening, she miscounted the mental birds, imagining 23 instead of the usual 25. This led to a cascade of mild anxiety, punctuated by sighs and a faint muttering about cosmic imbalance. The staff, trained in years of patient observation, simply rearranged cushions, adjusted curtains, and waited. Eventually, the birds were accounted for, or at least sufficiently imagined, and Margaret resumed her nightly poise, uninterrupted. Perhaps most interesting about Margaret Renshaw was how her insomnia influenced Victorian perceptions of elite rest. Whereas other sleepless individuals were pitted, Margaret was admired. Her nightly rituals were described in social diaries and whispered about in parlors. She became a symbol of disciplined wakefulness, proof that insomnia could be transformed from a flaw into a cultivated lifestyle. It is difficult to say whether this was beneficial or merely performative, but it undeniably added a layer of sophistication to an otherwise frustrating condition. In her later years, Margaret admitted to one interviewer that she occasionally wished for uninterrupted sleep, but she followed this statement with a serene smile, suggesting that the gentle artistry of insomnia had become inseparable from her identity. She never drank tonics, never submitted to chemical intervention, and never altered the slow choreography that defined her nights. To Margaret, the soft science of ritual was far more comforting than any remedy could ever be. And as we drift away from Lady Margaret's nocturnal theater, the candlelight flickering across shadowed walls, we can see how Victorian insomnia was not merely a medical challenge but also a social performance, one orchestrated by imagination, subtle ritual, and the careful cultivation of quiet eccentricity. From the softly lit drawing rooms of aristocrats to the bustling consulting rooms of doctors like Fenwick, the Victorian world demonstrated that sleeplessness could be as much a matter of identity as physiology. Lady Margaret Renshaw exemplifies this principle perfectly. Insomnia was not just endured, it was curated, refined, and displayed with all the elegance of a carefully rehearsed nocturnal ballet. As we leave her quietly pacing halls, we prepare to explore yet another dimension of Victorian sleeplessness, the methods, sometimes quaint, sometimes elaborate, that ordinary people used to chase rest in a world obsessed with nerves, status, and propriety. Unlike aristocrats such as Lady Margaret Renshaw, most Victorians suffered sleeplessness quietly, without lamps strategically casting shadows or imaginary birds leaving the mind through open windows. Their insomnia was less theatrical, more practical, and often shaped by necessity rather than ritual. Nevertheless, the approaches they adopted were fascinating in their own gentle, sometimes absurd way. In working-class homes, sleep was less about nerve culture and more about logistics. Families shared bedrooms. Sometimes entire households, parents, children, and occasionally an elderly aunt or cousin would occupy a single room. Privacy was scarce, noise was constant, and the air carried the combined sense of coal fires, cooking, and damp wool. Falling asleep under these circumstances required ingenuity. One common method was the evening draught. Not the alcoholic kind, although a few households secretly indulged in a sip of beer or cider, but a weak herbal infusion designed to calm the mind. Chamomile, peppermint, or occasionally valerian were steeped carefully, often in the same pot used for other household teas. The effectiveness was modest, but the act itself, pausing, preparing, and sipping a warm drink, became a nightly ritual that signaled it was time to rest. Even small routines had a soothing quality, a predictable rhythm in an otherwise noisy environment. Some families relied on temperature adjustment, though this was more improvised than scientific. Windows were open to let in cool night air, despite drafts and damp. Beds were layered with blankets, sometimes excessive, sometimes too few, depending on availability and season. In colder homes, people learned the delicate balance between warmth for comfort and heat-induced restlessness. Often, a blanket was tucked in around the head like a hood, which both muffled sound and created a small, private space for reflection, or complaints whispered into the dark. Another subtle strategy involved posture and positioning. Victorian advice manuals encouraged lying on the side rather than the back, keeping limbs relaxed, and arranging pillows to relieve pressure points. While some households applied this carefully, most families improvised, often stuffing extra cloth or folded clothing under heads to achieve something resembling comfort. These improvised pillows sometimes caused discomfort rather than relief, but the attempt was considered virtuous. One could not simply lie down haphazardly. Sleep required attention, even if it was difficult to attain. In middle-class households, mental routines often mirrored the practices of the aristocracy, albeit in simpler form. Writing in diaries or reflecting quietly on the day was encouraged. Gentle reading was permitted, usually of morally uplifting or instructive texts. Fiction existed, but only in moderation. Novels with excessive drama or erotic undertones were considered dangerous to fragile nerves. Victorian thinking insisted that overstimulated minds could not rest, so the bedtime environment became carefully controlled. Candles were dimmed, conversations softened, and even the pacing of domestic animals was noted. A restless dog could jeopardize the household's quietude. One particularly common middle-class cure was aromatic intervention, though on a modest scale. Dried herbs, often lavender or rosemary, were tucked into pillows or small sachets hung near the bed. The belief was that pleasant scents could calm the nervous system. While science might now question the efficacy, the aroma added a subtle sense of ritual, an olfactory cue signaling the body and mind to slow. Many households reported modest improvements, or at least a sense of reassurance, which counted for a lot in the Victorian worldview. It is worth noting that sleep aids were also widely available, particularly in urban centers. Pharmacies stocked mild tonics, valerian tablets, hop extracts, and concoctions labeled for nerve fortification. These were considered relatively safe, though overuse could lead to drowsiness or mild dependency. Laudanum, containing opium, was more potent and sometimes used in dire cases, but its application was cautious. Households rarely indulged in it casually. The risk of unpleasant consequences, nausea, fainting, or worse, outweighed the benefits. Instead, the emphasis remained on gentle measures, herbs, routines, and slow, mindful preparation for rest. Children, of course, required particular attention. Victorian manuals warned that youthful nerves were especially sensitive. Sleeping through the night was an achievement, not a given. Families established routines that included early evening meals, quiet play, and supervised reading. Toys were deliberately simple, designed to avoid overstimulation. One instructive guide recommended that children's bedrooms be free of bright colors or loud patterns. Instead, walls were painted muted shades, pale greens, soft yellows, gentle blues, and bedding was plain. Even the smallest details were believed to influence the quality of slumber. In some households, physical remedies played a significant role. Foot baths, inspired by the aristocratic trend, were adapted for practicality. A basin of warm water with a pinch of salt or a few herbs allowed families to relax muscles and prepare the body for rest. In larger houses, shared bathing routines sometimes became social affairs, quietly reinforcing calm through gentle conversation and slow movements. This embodied a Victorian principle. Sleep could be guided by both mind and body, harmoniously, even amid modest circumstances. For those who could afford it, special sleep rooms emerged, mirroring elite practices in simpler form. These spaces were insulated, dimly lit, and arranged to minimize noise and visual distraction. Heavy curtains, thick rugs, and strategic furniture placement transformed bedrooms into microenvironments conducive to rest. Often, these rooms were multifunctional. At night, bedrooms; during the day, sewing rooms or studies. Still, they embodied the same idea as aristocratic sleep chambers, that environment mattered as much as habit. Yet not every Victorian adopted these methods with zeal. Urban noise, overcrowding, illness, and economic stress often thwarted careful planning. Many relied on sheer perseverance, lying in bed until fatigue forced sleep, regardless of discomfort. Others tried more unusual remedies, ranging from rocking in chairs to reciting poetry aloud to themselves until the mind yielded. The underlying principle remained consistent. Sleep was worth pursuing methodically, even if success was slow or partial. Some households developed unofficial rituals peculiar to family culture. One family would ring a small bell at 9:30 p.m., signaling a collective pause in activity. Another placed a single candle in the window as a visual cue for nighttime stillness. These small gestures were designed to cue both body and mind, reinforcing calm and creating predictability, a principle echoed by doctors and manuals alike. Routine itself became a form of therapy, independent of herbal teas or tonics. The effectiveness of these practices varied, naturally. Some families reported improved sleep. Others developed tolerance to the interventions, requiring incremental changes, stronger scents, warmer baths, more deliberate pacing. This gradual evolution illustrates a Victorian mindset, persistent, meticulous, and slightly obsessive about maintaining control over the body, even amid the unpredictability of nightly restlessness. It is also worth noting the cultural overlay. Sleep was moral as well as physical. Those who rested poorly were sometimes seen as morally lax, inattentive, or excessively indulgent. Conversely, steady sleepers were considered disciplined, virtuous, and well-managed. This social dimension added another layer to domestic insomnia management, as families not only sought rest for health, but for propriety. Habit, environment, and perception intertwined, producing a subtle yet pervasive framework governing Victorian slumber. Interestingly, despite the prevalence of sleeplessness, few households relied heavily on chemical sedation. Instead, the soft science of insomnia, the gentle preparation of mind and body, the creation of a harmonious environment, the carefully timed rituals, dominated. This reflects a broader Victorian tendency, preference for order, subtlety, and incremental improvement over dramatic intervention. Sleep was a process to be cultivated, not forcibly imposed. By the late 19th century, these domestic practices were well documented. Manuals, pamphlets, and periodicals described step-by-step routines, including recommended herbal mixtures, positioning advice, and gentle nighttime exercises. Doctors increasingly acknowledged that household habits mattered as much as professional intervention. Victorian insomnia thus became both a private struggle and a socially guided endeavor, reflecting wider concerns with nervous health, domestic management, and the quiet pursuit of moral and physical balance. The combination of practical measures and cultural pressure produced a distinct experience. Families moved through evenings slowly, consciously, and with attention to detail. Evenings were structured, rooms were arranged deliberately, and every minor action, from tea preparation to foot baths, was imbued with purpose. This approach may not have guaranteed sleep, but it established a rhythm, a cadence of night that offered the illusion of control and sometimes the reality. In some, ordinary Victorian households approached insomnia with a combination of diligence, ritual, and modest ingenuity. They did not have the luxury of dramatic lamps or poetic meditation. They did not spend hours visualizing birds. Instead, they relied on accessible remedies, warmth, scent, gentle herbal teas, predictable routines, and careful attention to environmental factors. Sleep was pursued patiently, methodically, and often imperceptibly, a quiet triumph of persistence over discomfort. As we leave the common household behind, we can see how Victorian insomnia was both universal and highly contextual. From the theatrical aristocrat to the pragmatic middle-class family, the patterns repeat: soft science, gentle ritual, and the unshakable belief that sleep could be coaxed through attention, order, and an appreciation for the quiet poetry of nightly life. And as we drift toward our next chapter, we will explore the medicalization of insomnia, how doctors transformed these domestic practices into formal treatments, blending gentle science with cultural authority in ways that shaped the Victorian approach to sleeplessness for generations. By the late Victorian era, insomnia was no longer merely a private inconvenience or a domestic curiosity. Doctors began to assert authority over sleeplessness, transforming it from a household concern into a recognizable medical condition. The shift was subtle yet pervasive, and it combined Victorian attentiveness to the nervous system with a fascination for moral and social order. Sleep, doctors declared, could be studied, measured, and guided, if only the patient submitted to professional oversight. Dr. Archibald Hawthorne, for instance, was a London physician who specialized in nervous disorders. He believed insomnia arose from what he called cerebral congestion, a Victorian way of suggesting that the mind was too busy, too active, or too morally sensitive to rest naturally. His clinic was modest but methodical: heavy curtains, thick carpets, and a faint lavender scent designed to calm the mind. Hawthorne insisted that sleep was not merely physical but intellectual, requiring careful management of thoughts, diet, and environment. Patients visited Hawthorne for various reasons. Some sought relief from chronic overwork, others from social anxiety, and a few from inexplicable restlessness. The doctor's approach was meticulous. He examined handwriting to assess nerve tremor, listened for subtle tonal variations in speech, and sometimes had patients lie quietly while he observed facial tension. Every micro-expression, every habitual sigh, every twitch of the eyelid became a diagnostic clue. Sleep, it seemed, could be inferred from observation rather than attained by it. Hawthorne's prescriptions often resembled the domestic methods already practiced, but with a formal, scientific tone. He recommended regulated routines, including fixed bedtimes, gentle pre-sleep exercises, and controlled lighting. Herbal tonics were suggested, typically chamomile, hops, or valerian, often labeled with precise measurements and strict schedules. He discouraged alcohol or overly stimulating foods before bed, citing moral as well as physical reasoning. His manuals instructed, "A mind occupied with vice or indulgence cannot repose, no matter the softness of its pillow." Interestingly, doctors began to catalog insomnia cases as if they were studying species. Some patients were described as habitually wakeful, others as intermittently disturbed, and still others as morbidly sensitive. Case histories were published in medical journals, often accompanied by advice for domestic caregivers. Victorian insomnia, thus, moved from private nuisance to publicly recognized medical phenomenon. Families began to consult professionals not merely for extreme symptoms, but for guidance in everyday sleep hygiene. Dr. Emily Crawford, one of the few female physicians of the period, contributed a nuanced perspective. She focused on women who were often diagnosed with nervous excitability due to social constraints, domestic labor, or emotional strain. Crawford suggested that gentle massage, regulated exercise, and quiet reflection could correct underlying imbalances. Her emphasis on environmental and behavioral intervention contrasted with male colleagues' more chemical-focused remedies, but both approaches sought to formalize previously domestic practices. A common prescription combined dietary, environmental, and behavioral guidance. Patients were instructed to avoid stimulating foods such as coffee, rich desserts, or heavy meat before bed. Rooms were to be cool but not cold, dimly lit, and free from excessive noise. Bedclothes were arranged for maximum comfort, with attention to pillow height and mattress firmness. Mental routines included journaling, reading moral literature, or imagining restful scenes, echoing practices of aristocrats like Lady Margaret Renshaw. The medical emphasis simply added authority and language. Sleep became a measurable, manageable object of study. One particularly Victorian innovation was the nightly report system. Patients were encouraged to record the hour they went to bed, the number of awakenings, and subjective quality of sleep. Doctors, in turn, used these reports to adjust treatments. The practice reflected the era's obsession with quantification and control. Sleep could be documented, analyzed, and gradually optimized, even if only a little. Over time, these nightly logs became ritualized, reinforcing pre-existing domestic routines while lending the process a veneer of scientific legitimacy. Yet Victorian doctors did not reject chemical intervention entirely. Laudanum and chloral hydrate remained available, usually reserved for cases deemed severe or intractable. However, these treatments were administered cautiously, often with careful monitoring. The emphasis remained on soft interventions first, reinforcing the belief that insomnia was best addressed through environmental, behavioral, and moral measures before resorting to potent drugs. Sleep devices, too, proliferated under medical guidance. From adjustable beds to early reclining chairs, physicians recommended furniture and mechanical aids designed to encourage proper posture, circulation, and relaxation. Aromatherapy and herbal infusions were codified in manuals and lectures. The physician's role was partly therapeutic, partly didactic. Patients were expected to learn the art of sleep from a knowledgeable authority. Insomnia, once a private struggle, became an exercise in disciplined cooperation between doctor and patient. Doctors also codified morality and mental state as central to sleep. Anxiety, overindulgence, and social mismanagement were all considered contributors to sleeplessness. Victorian manuals encouraged emotional restraint, moderation in daily habits, and careful attention to personal conduct. Sleep became not merely a physiological necessity but a reflection of character. A well-ordered life facilitated well-ordered rest. Conversely, restless nights were interpreted as evidence of excess, emotional fragility, or mental disarray. This medicalization extended into literature and journalism. Popular magazines published articles instructing readers on sleep hygiene, often quoting physicians or citing experimental observations. Illustrated guides showed correct postures, ideal bedroom arrangements, and recommended herbal mixtures. Advice ranged from practical to elaborate, but the central idea was consistent. Insomnia could be addressed systematically if approached with diligence, attention, and proper guidance. Even ordinary households adapted these recommendations. Diaries and notebooks encouraged adherence to routines, gentle herbal teas became standardized, and bedroom layouts were adjusted to meet professional standards. Children were trained in pre-sleep exercises, adults in reflective meditation or journaling, and domestic animals were sometimes repositioned to minimize disturbance. Across social classes, the soft science of insomnia permeated daily life, blending aristocratic ritual, domestic improvisation, and medical authority. Physicians' influence also shaped perceptions of failure. Poor sleepers were not only suffering physically, they were seen as deficient in habits, attention, or moral discipline. Success required both compliance and self-awareness. This reinforced the Victorian ideal that routine, ritual, and vigilance were essential to all aspects of life, even the private act of sleeping. Insomnia was thus socially and medically framed, producing a culture in which rest could be pursued, quantified, and evaluated. Dr. Hawthorne, Dr. Crawford, and their contemporaries may not have always cured sleeplessness outright. Often, patients remained partially restless, waking in the middle of the night or feeling unrest despite adherence to advice. Yet the process itself offered reassurance. The combination of routine, guidance, and gentle intervention provided a sense of control. Victorian insomnia was reframed. It became not a mark of weakness but an opportunity for methodical improvement, moral reflection, and participation in a socially recognized practice. In effect, Victorian doctors turned insomnia into both a science and a cultural performance. Their interventions were subtle, combining environment, habit, and observation rather than dramatic chemical sedation. The domestic and aristocratic practices that had existed for decades were elevated to professional status. Sleep was no longer merely private. It was a project, a measurable, observable, and socially mediated process. Patients were guided to observe, correct, and manage themselves, cultivating a steady, measured relationship with the nightly struggle for rest. This system also encouraged persistence. Sleep might not arrive on the first night, or even the first week, but careful adherence promised incremental progress. Just as households had developed small rituals and aristocrats had cultivated theatrical routines, medical oversight created a framework in which insomnia could be gradually addressed through attention, ritual, and professional reinforcement. By framing insomnia as a condition requiring observation, intervention, and moral discipline, Victorian doctors left a lasting influence on the cultural understanding of sleeplessness. Their practices combined the practical, the domestic, and the aristocratic into a coherent whole. A belief that sleep could be guided through deliberate preparation, environment, and gentle intervention. And while their methods were sometimes idiosyncratic, they reflected a broader cultural commitment to order, refinement, and self-mastery, even in the quietest hours of the night. In the end, the medicalization of insomnia transformed private struggle into structured care. It codified routines, formalized domestic wisdom, and established a vocabulary for describing the subtle art of rest. Patients learned to engage with their own nightly practices consciously, whether through herbal teas, regulated bedtime rituals, or reflective meditation. Victorian sleeplessness, once a private burden, became a socially recognized and professionally guided experience. Victorian insomnia, while often quiet and methodical, was also shaped by personalities, both the patients who suffered from it and the doctors who claimed to cure it. By this stage in history, it became clear that the human element, quirks, obsessions, and social performance was just as important as herbal tonics, foot baths, or rigid routines. Some of the most memorable figures were not kings or aristocrats, but the ordinary and extraordinary individuals whose sleeplessness intertwined with curiosity, eccentricity, and gentle theatricality. Take Dr. Lionel Greaves, for example. Greaves was an older gentleman with a narrow waist, a wide collar perpetually tilted at a dramatic angle, and the kind of spectacles that magnified his eyes to startling proportions. His insomnia was mild but persistent, which he claimed gave him an intimate understanding of restless humanity. Greaves was obsessed with cataloging nervous habits. He instructed patients to note not only hours of sleep but movements in bed, eye twitches, and involuntary sighs. Every gesture became data. Every sigh became evidence. Greaves also had a peculiar bedside manner. He believed in sympathetic pacing, which involved walking slowly around the patient's bedroom while they tried to fall asleep. He would murmur gently about the night sky, the slow passing of time, or the virtues of quiet reflection. This method was oddly effective for some patients, mainly because the pacing acted as a predictable auditory and visual cue, though for others it produced nothing more than mild confusion. Still, Greaves insisted it was scientifically valid, often citing elaborate, unpublished notes that he referred to as the observations of midnight. His patients were equally memorable. Miss Evelyn Harrington, a young woman of delicate constitution, suffered from chronic wakefulness caused, according to Greaves, by overactive moral sensibility. Evelyn's insomnia was accompanied by nightly recitations of poetry, carefully selected and read aloud to herself in dim lamplight. Each verse was memorized, pronounced with precise intonation, and sometimes whispered to the family cat, who tolerated the practice with polite indifference. The recitations were considered therapeutic, both emotionally and nervously, though their effectiveness in producing actual sleep was inconsistent. Another patient, Mr. Percival Wren, had insomnia aggravated by excessive attention to household clocks. Wren was obsessed with the precise measurement of time, checking and adjusting clocks multiple times each evening. He believed that if the clocks were accurate, he would sleep accurately. Doctors like Greaves indulged the habit, turning it into a kind of ritualized pre-sleep observation, which, in true Victorian fashion, was considered constructive mental activity. Wren slept sporadically, but at least he felt morally correct in the process. Eccentric remedies proliferated alongside these personalities. Some doctors recommended foot compresses soaked in wine, believing that warmth combined with slight intoxication encouraged relaxation. Others suggested silent nocturnal reading aloud, a practice borrowed from elite circles but adapted for the middle class. Victorian insomnia, it seemed, was as much about ritualized behavior as chemical or physical intervention. The more idiosyncratic the practice, the more culturally validated it became. Greaves, in particular, enjoyed elaborate observation tables, a cross between clinical note-taking and artistic expression. He would sketch diagrams of bedroom layouts, annotate patient movements, and even include symbolic notations for imagined mental states. His reports read like poetry disguised as science. Patient turns thrice, sighs once. The brow furrows in gentle inquiry. The mind drifts eastward as if seeking the dawn. These notes were admired by some colleagues for their insight, dismissed by others as quaint or overwrought, and secretly enjoyed by patients who appreciated being chronicled with such elaborate attention. Another eccentric figure was Dr. Horace Lindley, who specialized in nervous afflictions among the urban poor. Lindley believed insomnia could be caused by social stimuli, the streetlights, the clatter of carts, or the emotional tumult of family life. He developed what he called environmental adjustments, advising low-cost measures such as padded window coverings, quiet zones in the house, and strategic candle placement. While not glamorous, these interventions often proved remarkably effective for families living in noisy, crowded conditions. Lindley's practice reflected a Victorian principle: even modest attention to environment could yield tangible improvements. Among his patients was the cheerful Mrs. Ada Pritchard, a widow with 3 children and a relentless sense of domestic responsibility. Ada's insomnia was worsened by worry over chores and the behavior of neighbors' children. Lindley suggested pre-bedtime organization, quiet reflection, and the strategic use of lavender sachets. Ada dutifully implemented each step, often accompanied by gentle reminders whispered to her children, "We must respect the night. Sleep is important." Her family adopted these routines with varying degrees of compliance, creating a household rhythm that mirrored, on a smaller scale, the aristocratic rituals of insomnia. Victorian insomnia, as we see, was not simply a medical condition but a reflection of personality, circumstance, and cultural expectation. Doctors like Greaves and Linley recognized this intuitively, blending observation, ritual, and gentle guidance to create individualized care plans. Even failed attempts, nightly pacing that produced only mild irritation, herbal infusions that tasted faintly of regret, or lamp adjustments that merely altered the angle of shadows, were framed as part of the process. Some patients developed personalized eccentricities that became their nightly trademark. One gentleman insisted on placing a single feather beneath his pillow to encourage aerodynamic thought patterns. Another young woman arranged all furniture at exactly 15-degree angles, claiming that geometric order encouraged cerebral calm. These practices were often indulged by physicians who treated eccentricity as an acceptable form of behavioral therapy. Victorian insomnia, after all, was as much about appearance, ritual, and moral comportment as about actual rest. Even mild insomnia was socially performative. Families, acquaintances, and neighbors noted sleepless behaviors with polite interest. Guests visiting an insomniac household often adapted their own evening routines, reading quietly, sipping weak tea, pacing softly, to maintain harmony. The shared experience of wakefulness became a subtle social bond, creating a culture in which insomnia was acknowledged, discussed, and ritualized rather than hidden or ignored. Doctors also codified mental exercises. Visualization, meditation, and reflective journaling were widely encouraged, sometimes accompanied by practical aids such as illustrated manuals or mnemonic devices. Patients were instructed to imagine calm landscapes, walk their minds through predictable sequences, or record minor details of the day to unload cerebral residue. These practices mirrored aristocratic meditation techniques, adapted for broader populations. Insomnia, in this sense, was treated as both a physiological and cognitive phenomenon. The Victorian fascination with eccentricity extended to public demonstrations. Lectures and small gatherings allowed doctors to showcase mild sleep remedies, invite observation of behaviors, and instruct audiences on optimal rest. Patients sometimes participated voluntarily, demonstrating correct posture, lamp positioning, or herbal preparation. The events were quiet, orderly, and ritualized, not dramatic, not alarming, but subtly performative. Insomnia was transformed into both spectacle and instruction, reinforcing cultural norms while maintaining the gentle monotony necessary for restful reflection. Yet despite the elaborate attention, Victorian insomnia rarely disappeared completely. Patients continued to experience occasional wakefulness, fleeting anxiety, and minor discomfort. Success was measured incrementally. A patient might sleep through half the night, or fall asleep faster, or feel calmer despite interrupted rest. The emphasis was less on total elimination and more on cultivating habits that encouraged peace, patience, and controlled nightly ritual. In this light, eccentric doctors and peculiar patients were both co-creators of the Victorian sleep experience. Physicians codified domestic wisdom, formalized rituals, and provided moral and scientific frameworks. Patients contributed personality, creativity, and idiosyncrasy, developing nightly practices that reflected both social expectation and personal preference. Together, they produced a culture in which insomnia was understood, guided, and subtly celebrated. As the night deepens, we can appreciate the quiet artistry of these interactions. Sleep, once a simple physiological necessity, became a field of careful observation, ritualized behavior, and nuanced guidance. The eccentricity of doctors and patients alike was not merely tolerated, it was essential to the culture of rest, providing a gentle rhythm and social structure that supported nightly reflection, calm, and intermittent repose. And as we leave these quiet rooms and softly flickering lamps behind, we prepare to explore Chapter 8, which examines the Victorian obsession with experimental remedies, from gentle herbal infusions to mildly theatrical mechanical devices, and how these inventions reflected the era's fascination with order, control, and the slow, deliberate pursuit of sleep. By the late 19th century, Victorian insomnia had evolved into a landscape of experimentation. Patients, households, and doctors alike sought remedies that ranged from the simple to the theatrical, each reflecting the era's fascination with control, ritual, and gentle scientific inquiry. Where herbal teas, lamp adjustments, and reflective journaling had once sufficed, increasingly elaborate interventions appeared, mechanical devices, environmental adjustments, and precisely measured routines, all designed to coax rest from minds and bodies that refused to comply. One of the most notable figures in this experimental phase was Dr. Percival Harcourt, a man of slight build, large spectacles, and a habit of tapping his chin with a silver pencil whenever considering a patient's nightly regimen. Harcourt was obsessed with mechanical solutions. He believed that the mind, like any machine, could be guided into proper function through carefully calibrated devices. Among his inventions was a nocturnal repose chair, a reclining seat with adjustable angles, padded supports, and a faint hum produced by a small internal mechanism intended to mimic the gentle rhythm of a calm heartbeat. Patients who tried the chair often reported a mild sense of relaxation, though whether sleep followed was inconsistent. Still, the chair became fashionable among urban households, partly because it was visually impressive and partly because it suggested that one was engaging with insomnia scientifically. The device was often described in medical journals with diagrams and detailed instructions, including recommended sitting angles, durations, and subtle breathing patterns. Victorian readers were reassured by the precision, even if the results remained modest. Other mechanical inventions included weighted blankets, which had a faintly medical air of authority. These blankets were stuffed with horsehair, small beads, or grains, providing gentle pressure designed to calm restless limbs. Instructions were meticulous. The blanket had to be heavy enough to soothe, but not so heavy as to impede circulation. The gentle pressure created a sensation of containment, a tactile reassurance that some doctors believed encouraged sleep. Housewives who could afford the materials sometimes made their own, often stitching them with care, adding decorative covers to maintain domestic propriety. Perhaps the most theatrical devices were metal headbands and early cranial pads, intended to align nerve centers or regulate cerebral vibration. These were usually paired with quiet, seated reflection or reclining exercises. The exact mechanism was poorly understood, even by doctors, but patients appreciated the ritual. The placement, adjustment, and measured duration of the device added structure to the otherwise unpredictable process of falling asleep. Victorian culture, with its emphasis on observation, order, and refinement, provided fertile ground for these slightly eccentric, mildly mechanical interventions. Experimental remedies were not limited to devices. Herbal combinations evolved in complexity, sometimes blending multiple botanicals in precise ratios. Dr. Lionel Greaves, whom we met in the previous chapter, recommended concoctions of chamomile, valerian, hops, and a touch of dried lavender, carefully measured for consistency. Patients were instructed to steep mixtures for exact durations, often timing the process with a small clock placed nearby. The attention to detail, rather than the ingredients themselves, was believed to cultivate calm. Victorian insomnia, once a matter of nerves or circumstance, became a practice in patient precision. In addition to herbs and devices, ambient modifications were widely promoted. Adjustable gas lamps, carefully positioned mirrors, and heavy drapery allowed patients to control lighting, shadows, and reflection. Even the direction of airflow was considered significant. Windows were opened or closed according to season, wind, and perceived mental effect. These environmental interventions were subtle, but they reinforced the idea that the home could be engineered to foster rest. The house itself became a participant in the nightly ritual, quietly aiding or hindering sleep depending on attention to detail. Some families developed micro-rituals centered around these devices. Weighted blankets were combined with quiet herbal consumption. Chairs were positioned near windows to maximize moonlight and evening calm. Lamps were dimmed at precise intervals. Even children were sometimes instructed to observe these procedures in silence, internalizing the structured approach to rest. The result was a household rhythm that gently prepared everyone for sleep, whether they ultimately achieved it or not. In urban centers, sleep parlors emerged, offering access to mechanical devices, ambient adjustments, and supervised herbal treatments. These were modest rooms, often decorated with heavy curtains, padded chairs, and discreet lamps. Patients visited for sessions ranging from 30 minutes to an hour, guided by attendants or physicians trained to adjust devices and monitor responses. Sleep parlors represented a formalization of domestic and aristocratic practices, extending the soft science of insomnia into a commercial and semi-professional sphere. Doctors increasingly emphasized habitual engagement with experimental remedies. Consistency, rather than dramatic intervention, became key. Patients were instructed to practice routines nightly, adjusting positions, herbal steeping, and mechanical devices in tandem. Even minor deviations were noted, with careful instructions on correction. Victorian insomnia, it appeared, was less about miraculous cures and more about establishing a deliberate, measured nightly cadence. The practice itself became therapeutic, reinforcing calm through predictability and structure. Interestingly, some mechanical devices served symbolic rather than strictly functional purposes. Metal cradles, pendulum timers, and softly ticking instruments were incorporated more for their suggestion of control than actual physiological effect. Patients reported feeling reassured simply by the presence of these objects. The subtle interplay of ritual, observation, and minor technological intervention illustrates a Victorian principle. Sleep was as much cultivated through belief and expectation as through tangible action. Even the most elaborate remedies were often paired with behavioral reinforcement. Journaling, slow breathing, and evening reflection complemented devices and herbal infusions. Patients were encouraged to note successes and failures, to observe their own habits, and to practice mindfulness long before the term existed. This holistic approach combined mind, body, and environment, offering a gentle, structured approach to sleeplessness that reflected both scientific curiosity and cultural expectation. As the century drew toward its close, these practices became widely disseminated. Manuals, periodicals, and lectures provided step-by-step instructions for mechanical, herbal, and environmental methods. Households incorporated them gradually, adapting complexity to means and circumstance. Aristocrats maintained theatrical or ritualized practices, middle-class families adopted simplified versions, and working households improvised with available materials. The culture of Victorian insomnia thus spans social classes while preserving a consistent emphasis on ritual, observation, and gentle intervention. Experimental remedies also reflected the Victorian fascination with order and control. Devices, herbs, and routines allowed people to impose structure on a condition that was inherently unpredictable. Insomnia, once considered a private nuisance, became a domain of deliberate management, where each action, steeping a tea, adjusting a blanket, calibrating a chair, contributed to a larger sense of mastery over the night. This approach was soothing, if not immediately effective. It provided reassurance, ritual, and the gentle illusion of control, which in the Victorian worldview was often as important as actual sleep. Moreover, experimental devices emphasized individualized care. No two patients followed exactly the same combination of remedies. Physicians adapted treatments based on observed habits, household environments, and personal temperament. The process was iterative. Minor adjustments were made nightly, responses were observed, and routines evolved. Victorian insomnia became a collaborative practice between patient, household, and sometimes physician, blending personality, circumstance, and scientific aspiration. Finally, these interventions demonstrate the cultural aesthetics of Victorian sleeplessness. Rest was not merely functional. It was cultivated with style, attention, and ritual. Devices were carefully arranged, herbs steeped with precision, lamps and shadows orchestrated with deliberate care. Sleep was both practical and performative, echoing earlier aristocratic practices while embracing middle-class accessibility and scientific aspiration. Even when sleep failed to arrive, the rituals themselves offered structure, calm, and reassurance, a gentle, slow-moving therapy for body and mind. In summary, the late Victorian fascination with experimental remedies and mechanical devices reflects a unique synthesis of science, culture, and domestic practice. Sleep was pursued methodically, ritualistically, and with aesthetic attention, creating a landscape in which insomnia was both a challenge and an opportunity. Patients, households, and physicians collaborated in nightly routines that blended herbalism, machinery, environmental control, and behavioral guidance. The result was a softly structured, socially validated, and mildly theatrical approach to rest, gentle, methodical, and subtly comforting. One of the most visible consequences was in household management. Families adjusted routines to accommodate sleepless members, particularly those whose insomnia was pronounced or ritualized. Bedrooms were arranged to minimize noise and light, evening tasks were carefully sequenced to ensure calm, and children were subtly trained to avoid abrupt activity during late hours. Insomnia became a structuring force, influencing the pace and rhythm of domestic life in ways that often went unnoticed. In many households, sleep rituals evolved into social exercises. Gentle pacing, quiet reading, herbal preparation, and lamp adjustment were shared practices that reinforced family cohesion. Even minor acts, smoothing a blanket, adjusting a pillow, or whispering reminders to children, became elements of a nightly choreography. From the aristocratic lamp adjustments of Lady Margaret Renshaw to the experimental devices of Dr. Harcourt, the Victorian era illustrates how sleep, nerves, and culture intertwined. Insomnia was not merely endured, it was observed, ritualized, and softly curated. And as we prepare to move into Chapter 10, we will examine the literary and artistic reflections of sleeplessness, exploring how the Victorian imagination absorbed, transformed, and celebrated the quiet drama of the night. By the turn of the 20th century, Victorian insomnia had become a subtle cultural motif, leaving traces not only in domestic life and medical practice but in literature, visual art, and even theater. Writers and artists captured the quiet, reflective, and sometimes peculiar aspects of sleeplessness, turning nights awake into a canvas for moral contemplation, social observation, and gentle narrative experimentation. The phenomenon of insomnia was no longer confined to bedrooms. It had entered the imagination. Consider the works of George Eliot, who often depicted characters with restless nights and reflective wakefulness. In novels like Middlemarch, sleeplessness was portrayed as a sign of intellectual engagement, moral sensitivity, or emotional tension. A character lying awake in a dimly lit room might ponder social obligations, the consequences of a misjudged action, or the subtleties of domestic management. Sleep, or the lack of it, was intertwined with reflection and conscience, quietly shaping the narrative rhythm. Similarly, Thomas Hardy used insomnia to explore emotional and existential nuance. Characters who experienced restless nights often did so because of moral dilemmas, unspoken grief, or social pressure. Hardy's depictions were rarely dramatic or sensational. Instead, they were measured, contemplative, and rhythmically slow, echoing the gentle pacing of nightly wakefulness. The reader, like the insomniac character, was invited to move through the night in slow, deliberate reflection. Victorian poets also engaged with the theme. Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning, for instance, incorporated quiet, watchful nights into their verse. Lines describing sleepless contemplation, moonlit rooms, or faintly ticking clocks created a sense of calm yet persistent attention to inner life. These nocturnal images reflected the domestic and medical routines already in place, linking personal observation to wider cultural ideals of patience, reflection, and moral cultivation. Insomnia became both subject and metaphor, gently reinforcing the cultural scripts established by households and physicians alike. Visual artists, too, found inspiration in sleeplessness. Paintings and illustrations often depicted solitary figures in dimly lit rooms, reclining chairs positioned carefully, lamps casting soft shadows, and desks or tables holding open journals or herbal infusions. These images were rarely dramatic. They emphasized stillness, reflection, and gentle ritual. Art captured the quiet geometry of domestic routines, highlighting the Victorian appreciation for order, observation, and the measured orchestration of nightly life. One particularly illustrative example comes from James Tissot's late-period interiors, which occasionally portrayed women in subdued evening light, engaged in reflection, reading, or embroidery. The emphasis was on posture, environment, and the subtle cues of routine. A turned page, a slightly tilted lamp, the careful positioning of cushions. Tizot's work mirrored real household practice, echoing both aristocratic ritual and middle-class adaptation. Insomnia, in these artistic depictions, became both real and symbolic, emphasizing attention to detail, social propriety, and reflective calm. Theatrical representations also acknowledged sleeplessness, though in restrained form. Plays often included late-night scenes with characters pacing softly, whispering to children, or arranging objects carefully before bed. These moments were quiet, almost meditative, creating dramatic tension through subtle social or emotional observation rather than action. The audience was invited into the slow rhythm of the night, witnessing the orchestration of environment, habit, and reflection that defined Victorian approaches to insomnia. Literature and art together reinforced the social and moral framing of sleeplessness. The restless mind was often linked to virtue, intellect, or moral sensibility. Characters who slept poorly were attentive, conscientious, and reflective. Conversely, those who disregarded routine or environment were portrayed as less disciplined or morally lax. Victorian insomnia, as represented in art and literature, became both a mirror and a guide. It reflected social expectations while subtly teaching them through observation and example. The symbolic language of insomnia was also tied to time and rhythm. Clocks, moonlight, and measured gestures appeared frequently, emphasizing the deliberate pacing of night. Observing the slow movement of shadows, noting the passing of hours, or attending to the flicker of a lamp became metaphors for self-discipline and controlled reflection. These motifs mirrored domestic routines, medical advice, and mechanical interventions, unifying practical experience with cultural representation. Artistic and literary portrayals often highlighted the intersection of environment and introspection. The carefully arranged bedroom, the scented pillow, the reclining chair, and the quietly ticking clock were not merely props. They symbolized the Victorian belief that sleep was cultivated, managed, and morally significant. Characters were often depicted engaging with these elements deliberately, reflecting the broader cultural practice of aligning environment, habit, and consciousness. Interestingly, these cultural representations also acknowledged eccentricity and individuality. Just as real-life patients developed personal rituals, literary and artistic figures were shown engaging in idiosyncratic practices, reciting poetry, arranging furniture, or pacing with precise timing. These eccentricities were framed gently, often with quiet humor or affectionate observation, emphasizing the uniqueness of each night and each individual's approach to rest. Victorian insomnia, in this sense, was both communal and deeply personal. Another recurring theme was the moral dimension of observation. Characters who lay awake were encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to reflect on conduct, social obligations, or personal improvement. Sleep became intertwined with conscience, emphasizing self-discipline, ethical attention, and emotional regulation. Insomnia was rarely portrayed as chaotic or purely physiological. It was a medium for cultivation of character and domestic attentiveness, consistent with broader Victorian values. As a result, insomnia influenced not only depiction but narrative structure. Slow pacing, reflective interiority, and attention to minute gestures mirrored the lived experience of sleeplessness. Authors and artists allowed their audience to inhabit the rhythm of the night, moving gently through observation, ritual, and reflection. The experience of reading, viewing, or attending a performance mirrored the insomniac's nightly navigation of environment, thought, and habit. This integration of domestic practice, medical guidance, and cultural production created a distinctly Victorian approach to sleeplessness. Insomnia was not simply a symptom or inconvenience. It was an opportunity for reflection, ritual, and subtle social performance. Households, doctors, writers, and artists all participated in a culture that acknowledged the quiet drama of the night, celebrated the slow rhythm of observation, and reinforced moral and practical ideals. Moreover, the representation of sleeplessness often included gentle humor and irony, much as in real domestic practice. Characters were occasionally depicted fussing over pillows, adjusting lamps with exaggerated precision, or pacing while murmuring poetic reflections. The effect was not comic in a loud sense, but mildly ironic, lightly playful, and soothingly mundane. Cultural depictions echoed the real-life blend of ritual, persistence, and gentle eccentricity that defined Victorian insomnia. In summary, literary and artistic reflections of Victorian sleeplessness codified, celebrated, and gently amplified the experiences of households, patients, and doctors. They emphasized reflection, ritual, and environmental awareness, linked insomnia to virtue, intellect, and moral sensibility, and highlighted individuality, precision, and subtle eccentricity. Nights Awake became both subject and structure, mirrored in narrative, visual composition, and dramatic pacing. Victorian insomnia was thus simultaneously lived, observed, and artfully represented, creating a cultural pattern that celebrated the quiet drama of reflection, habit, and persistence. As we drift toward the end of our exploration of Victorian sleeplessness, it becomes clear that the era left a surprisingly durable legacy. The rituals, remedies, and cultural practices developed to manage insomnia did not vanish with the decline of the empire. Instead, they quietly shaped modern approaches to sleep, influencing domestic habits, medical perspectives, and psychological theories throughout the 20th century. Victorian insomnia, in many ways, created a blueprint for thinking about rest, routine, and the mind's nightly rhythms. One major contribution was the codification of routine. Victorian households and physicians emphasized consistency, fixed bedtimes, deliberate pacing, measured use of light and sound, and the ritualized consumption of herbal infusions. These practices highlighted the importance of habitual preparation for sleep, a principle that remains central to contemporary sleep hygiene. Bedtime routines, relaxation exercises, and environmental adjustments are modern echoes of these Victorian innovations. The simple idea that sleep is cultivated through predictable, gentle repetition traces back to domestic and medical strategies perfected over decades. The medicalization of insomnia also laid the groundwork for early psychological approaches. Doctors like Greaves, Lindley, and Crawford observed that thoughts, habits, and emotional states influence the quality of sleep. They encouraged journaling, reflective meditation, and careful attention to personal behavior, anticipating later cognitive and behavioral interventions. The Victorian focus on mind, habit, and moral attention subtly anticipated the development of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, more than a century later. Their attention to observation, habit, and reflection created a conceptual framework that would later inform clinical understanding. Even mechanical and experimental devices contributed to lasting influence. Weighted blankets, reclining chairs, ambient lighting, and gentle auditory cues persist in contemporary design, albeit with modern materials and a scientific veneer. These devices reflected the Victorian belief that environment, posture, and subtle sensory inputs could shape sleep quality. Today's sleep technology, including ergonomic beds, white noise machines, and adjustable lighting systems, owes a quiet debt to these early experiments. While science has refined efficacy, the fundamental principle that external factors can guide the mind and body toward rest remains intact. Victorian insomnia also shaped cultural perceptions of wakefulness and productivity. Sleeplessness was never purely negative. It was linked to reflection, moral refinement, and intellectual engagement. Nighttime contemplation was culturally valorized, particularly among literate and artistic classes. This dual view of insomnia, as both challenge and opportunity, persisted into the 20th century, influencing attitudes toward work, creativity, and personal discipline. Writers, artists, and thinkers continued to frame wakefulness as a quiet space for insight, reflection, or careful observation, echoing the values instilled by Victorian households and medical advice. In domestic life, the Victorian emphasis on environmental and ritualized control of sleep became foundational. Bedrooms continued to be arranged for calm, with attention to lighting, temperature, and comfort. Nighttime routines remained structured, blending personal reflection with measured domestic activity. The careful orchestration of sleep, whether through herbal teas, evening reading, or gentle pacing, persisted across generations, demonstrating how Victorian ideals of order, refinement, and methodical care shaped everyday life long after the era itself had passed. Even gendered patterns persisted. Women, historically monitored for signs of nervous excitement, continued to encounter culturally mediated expectations around nightly reflection, moderation, and emotional regulation. Men, encouraged toward mechanical or physical interventions, maintained a focus on posture, physical comfort, and practical environmental adjustments. These patterns contributed to enduring norms in the domestic management of sleep, subtly shaping expectations and behaviors across households well into the 20th century. Literature and art preserved these ideals as well. Writers and illustrators of the early 20th century often referenced nightly rituals, reflective wakefulness, and domestic order in ways that echoed Victorian sensibilities. Nighttime contemplation, careful attention to environment, and the moral or intellectual significance of sleeplessness remained present in novels, poetry, and visual representation. The cultural memory of Victorian insomnia continued to influence how society represented and understood the quiet rhythms of night. Psychology, in particular, drew inspiration from Victorian practices. The emphasis on observation, journaling, and reflective habit laid the conceptual foundation for later therapeutic approaches. Patients were encouraged to observe their own behaviors, identify patterns of restlessness, and engage in incremental adjustment, principles that resonate with modern behavioral therapy and structured interventions. Victorian insomnia was not only a medical challenge but a cultural laboratory where habits, environment, and cognition were studied in the slow, deliberate rhythm of nightly routine. Interestingly, Victorian influence can also be seen in modern sleep culture, including trends such as mindfulness, meditation, and ambient environmental design. Weighted blankets, herbal teas, calming rituals, and carefully arranged bedrooms echo directly from the experimental, domestic, and medical practices of the era. The attention to ritual, environment, and self-observation remains central to contemporary approaches, demonstrating the enduring value of Victorian experimentation and methodical care. Even subtle social and moral aspects of insomnia persisted. Awareness of how one's wakefulness affected others, attention to gentle behavior, and the quiet performance of nightly rituals continued to shape domestic and social interactions. Insomnia remained a socially mediated experience, where behavior, observation, and subtle etiquette intertwined. Households, roommates, and family members maintained rhythms shaped by consideration, ritual, and reflection, an inheritance from the moral and domestic framing established during the Victorian period. The legacy extends to modern healthcare. Sleep studies, behavioral interventions, and clinical guidance for insomnia reflect the dual focus of Victorian practice: attention to physiological, environmental, and cognitive factors. While modern science has clarified mechanisms and efficacy, the foundational principle that sleep can be influenced through structured attention to behavior, environment, and thought remains remarkably consistent with Victorian approaches. Physicians of that era, with their careful observation, gentle guidance, and codified routines, anticipated the basic philosophy of sleep medicine over a century later. Even the gentle humor, ritualized eccentricity, and performative dimension of Victorian insomnia has persisted culturally. People still develop personal bedtime routines, adopt idiosyncratic habits to aid rest, and imbue their nightly preparations with attention, intention, and sometimes subtle whimsy. The quiet, methodical, and socially mediated character of Victorian insomnia left a lasting impression, shaping not only health practices but also the cultural imagination surrounding sleep. Finally, the Victorian approach underscores the enduring importance of patience, observation, and incremental progress. Sleep was rarely immediate or perfectly controlled. Instead, it was cultivated through careful attention, repeated practice, and subtle experimentation. The lessons of Victorian insomnia, gentle persistence, structured routine, and attention to environment and mind, continue to inform modern practices, from behavioral therapy to domestic habits to the subtle orchestration of personal rest. In conclusion, the legacy of Victorian insomnia is multifaceted. It influenced domestic routine, medical understanding, cultural representation, artistic depiction, and early psychological insight. The rituals, devices, and reflective practices developed during this era quietly shaped the ways we think about and pursue sleep today. Nights awake were transformed from private struggle into structured opportunity for reflection, methodical intervention, and gentle cultivation. Victorian sleeplessness, in its quiet, deliberate, and mildly theatrical fashion, continues to resonate across time, leaving a subtle but enduring imprint on how we navigate the night. And as we finally drift from the softly lit rooms, the carefully adjusted chairs, and the meticulously steeped teas, we can appreciate the full arc of Victorian insomnia, from private household nuisance to medicalized, ritualized, and culturally celebrated phenomenon. The night, with all its gentle challenges and reflective opportunities, remains a space of observation, ritual, and calm cultivation, a legacy that whispers softly, century after century. Victorian insomnia did more than shape personal behavior and medical advice. It also stimulated a remarkable wave of domestic invention and adaptation. Households, particularly in urban centers, became laboratories of innovation, combining practical necessity with gentle experimentation. Beds, chairs, lamps, and even room layouts were carefully adjusted, often in conjunction with mechanical devices, herbal remedies, and meticulously timed routines. The household itself was part of the cure, a quiet, living instrument for cultivating rest. One notable area of innovation was bed design. While four-poster beds had long served both aesthetic and practical purposes, the late Victorian era saw refinements aimed at comfort and support. Mattresses were often layered with varying materials, horsehair, coir, and wool, to produce optimal firmness and subtle cushioning. Bed frames were carefully measured to minimize noise from movement, and posts or railings were sometimes added to encourage correct sleeping posture. Even small details, such as the angle of the mattress or the height of pillows, were meticulously adjusted, reflecting a cultural preoccupation with precise, deliberate comfort. In parallel, reclining chairs and chaise longues became increasingly common. These were not merely decorative, they were positioned in bedrooms or parlors to provide gentle support for reading, reflection, or pre-sleep meditation. Adjustable mechanisms allowed individuals to vary posture, often in combination with weighted blankets or subtle ambient lighting. The furniture itself became a therapeutic instrument, reflecting the Victorian belief that restfulness could be cultivated through deliberate arrangement and measured comfort. Lighting innovations were another domain of subtle yet significant adaptation. Adjustable oil lamps and early gas lamps allowed households to control brightness and shadow, producing soft illumination conducive to calm reflection. Mirrors were strategically placed to reflect light without producing glare, and shades were often modified to direct light downward. The precise orchestration of lighting, combined with ambient quiet and carefully timed routines, created a domestic environment optimized for gentle mental preparation for sleep. Closely tied to lighting was environmental management. Households experimented with airflow, humidity, and temperature, often through layered drapery, window placement, and selective ventilation. The timing of window opening, the weight and placement of curtains, and even the use of room dividers were employed to produce subtly controlled conditions. These modifications were intended not to eliminate sleeplessness entirely but to facilitate calm, reduce distraction, and signal the body that the night was a space for reflection and rest. Victorian ingenuity also extended to sound management. Carpets, rugs, and wall hangings were employed to soften footsteps, reduce echoes, and dampen ambient noise. Heavy draperies minimized street sounds in urban households, while carefully placed furniture absorbed and redirected unwanted sound. Even in working-class homes, adaptive strategies emerged. Improvised curtains, strategically placed furnishings, and quiet domestic routines helped to create a measure of tranquility amidst bustling households. Sound was treated as a malleable element, as important as light, warmth, or posture, and manipulation of auditory stimuli became a recognized component of nightly preparation. Bedside tables and small furnishings were also adapted to insomnia. Trays for herbal infusions, small journals, and reading materials were arranged for convenience, reducing the need to move in low light. The careful orchestration of objects within reach created a controlled, predictable environment. Every item had purpose: tea steeped at the correct time, journals opened for reflection, and writing implements positioned to encourage observation of the night. The domestic space became a subtly choreographed stage for the nightly ritual of insomnia, blending practicality, aesthetics, and gentle moral instruction. Even household textiles were implicated. Curtains, blankets, and bed linens were selected with both texture and thermal properties in mind. Fabrics were layered for subtle warmth, softness, and quietude. Weighted blankets, as previously noted, were increasingly manufactured or handmade with precise attention to materials. Scented sachets, often lavender or rose, were placed under pillows or among linens, adding an olfactory dimension to the orchestration of calm. Victorian households treated touch, scent, and temperature with careful attention, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of sensory contribution to rest. Domestic adaptations were also ritualized. Households established nightly sequences: dimming lamps, arranging pillows, steeping herbal teas, adjusting airflow, and engaging in reflection or journaling. Even minor deviations were noted and corrected. Children were instructed in soft-footed behavior, quiet reading, or reflective exercises, learning both the rituals of domestic order and the social expectations surrounding rest. Sleep became a measured, communal practice, embedding social, moral, and practical norms within the household environment. One particularly elaborate adaptation was the multi-room approach to insomnia. In wealthier households, separate chambers were designated for different phases of the night: a room for reflection or journaling, a quiet room for herbal tea and pacing, and finally the bedroom for actual rest. Furniture, lighting, and environmental adjustments were coordinated across rooms, creating a controlled, sequential experience of nightly preparation. This approach emphasized the ritualized, methodical, and mildly theatrical nature of Victorian insomnia. Even modest households adapted similar principles, albeit on a simpler scale. Single-room orchestration involved rearrangement of furniture, strategic placement of candles or lamps, and quiet rituals involving herbal teas or reflective journaling. Noise reduction strategies, selective lighting, and measured timing became the primary tools for cultivating calm. The emphasis on precision, repetition, and gentle ritual was remarkably consistent across social classes, reflecting a shared cultural framework for managing sleeplessness. Households also experimented with domestic automation of sorts, subtle mechanical or practical interventions that anticipated later sleep technologies. Early forms of temperature regulation, light dimmers, and sound mitigation were incorporated into domestic routines, creating environments subtly tuned to the demands of the night. The combination of mechanical, environmental, and ritualized strategies reflected the Victorian integration of science, aesthetics, and moral attentiveness. Sleep was treated as a process to be managed, cultivated, and refined with care. Importantly, these domestic adaptations were not rigid prescriptions but flexible frameworks. Families adjusted sequences, modified furniture arrangements, and experimented with herbal combinations according to individual temperament and circumstance. Even failed strategies were informative, producing minor adjustments that contributed to the ongoing refinement of nightly routines. Victorian households treated insomnia not as an external imposition but as an interactive, domestic challenge, one to be navigated thoughtfully and deliberately. The cumulative effect of these innovations and adaptations was a domestic culture of attentiveness. Sleep, rest, and nighttime activity were orchestrated with measured attention, combining environmental control, ritualized behavior, and sensory management. Households became laboratories for gentle experimentation, refining furniture, lighting, airflow, textiles, and ritual in tandem with medical advice and personal observation. Even small households participated, demonstrating the accessibility and adaptability of Victorian insomnia practices. Through these domestic inventions and adaptations, Victorian insomnia left a lasting legacy. Many contemporary sleep practices, from carefully arranged bedrooms to nighttime reflection routines, owe their origin to the meticulous observation, experimentation, and subtle ingenuity of this era. The domestic environment was transformed from passive setting to active participant in sleep cultivation, shaping both nightly experience and broader cultural attitudes toward rest. In essence, Victorian households treated insomnia as a slow, deliberate art, an orchestration of space, habit, and ritual. Furniture, lighting, textiles, airflow, and quiet behavior were combined to produce a measured, predictable, and gently performative nightly routine. Insomnia was not simply endured, it was observed, managed, and creatively engaged. The household itself became both stage and instrument, reflecting cultural values, social norms, and the subtle interplay of mind, body, and environment. As we drift from these softly lit rooms, carefully arranged chairs, and gently scented linens, we can appreciate the quiet artistry of Victorian domestic innovation. Sleeplessness, once a simple inconvenience, became an arena for careful observation, ritualized behavior, and gentle experimentation. The household itself, through furniture, lighting, textiles, and ritual, participated in the cultivation of calm, an enduring lesson that continues to resonate in modern approaches to sleep, environment, and nightly routine. By mid to late Victorian times, household and medical attention to insomnia extended naturally into the realm of diet and nutrition. While the effects of specific foods were only partially understood, there was a prevailing sense that what one consumed in the evening could significantly influence one's ability to sleep. Meals, teas, and lightly medicated beverages were carefully timed and portioned, creating another layer of ritualized attention designed to guide the restless body toward calm. Evening meals were deliberately modest in many households, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Heavy, fatty foods were discouraged. Instead, diners might enjoy lightly cooked vegetables, small portions of fish or poultry, and carefully prepared breads. Meals were often served at least 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, reflecting the belief that digestion and sleep were intimately linked. Families were instructed to move gently, speak quietly, and avoid agitation after dining, integrating behavior, timing, and consumption into a holistic approach to rest. Herbal teas became a cornerstone of Victorian evening nutrition. Chamomile, valerian, hops, and lavender were combined in precise ratios, sometimes with honey or a touch of lemon, steeped for carefully timed intervals, and consumed in small, deliberate sips. Physicians recommended particular temperatures and timing, emphasizing ritual and sensory engagement as much as pharmacological effect. Drinking tea became a reflective exercise. The warmth of the cup, the aroma of herbs, and the deliberate pacing of consumption all contributed to a sense of calm anticipation of rest. Cocoa, lightly sweetened milk, and other gentle beverages were also popular. These drinks were believed to provide mild comfort without overstimulation. Even small indulgences were carefully measured, and Victorian households often maintained separate cups for evening use, sometimes subtly scented or weighted to reinforce the ritualized nature of nighttime consumption. The act of drinking itself became part of the orchestration of calm, measured, attentive, and quietly performative. Sugar and alcohol were treated with caution. While small amounts of wine or fortified beverages might appear in evening meals, they were rarely considered true remedies for insomnia. Physicians often warned against overindulgence, observing that excess could disrupt the very calm they sought to cultivate. In households, children were encouraged to avoid stimulants entirely, and adults were guided toward moderation, integrating self-restraint into the nightly pattern of behavior. Snacks, too, were approached with care. A lightly toasted slice of bread, a few nuts, or a small piece of fruit might be allowed, often in combination with a tea or gentle milk beverage. These minor indulgences were measured in both quantity and timing, reinforcing the overarching principle that even small elements of consumption could influence the delicate balance of the nervous system. Every sip, bite, and flavor became part of a careful choreography aimed at producing calm, measured wakefulness that gently transitioned into sleep. Beyond individual meals and beverages, the timing of consumption was emphasized. Victorian insomnia guidance often recommended strict schedules: supper at the same hour each evening, tea consumed after a fixed interval, herbal infusions prepared and drunk according to precise timings. Deviations from this schedule were subtly discouraged, reflecting the broader cultural emphasis on routine, observation, and predictable order. The body, like the household, was expected to adapt to the rhythm of the night through repetition and gentle consistency. Physicians also experimented with lightly medicated drinks. Small doses of tinctures or tonics were sometimes added to evening beverages, intended to calm the nervous system or soothe minor agitation. These were typically subtle, designed to complement ritual and environment rather than serve as dramatic sedatives. Patients were advised to consume them slowly, observing bodily responses and adjusting timing as necessary. The process reinforced attentiveness, patience, and reflective engagement, principles central to Victorian insomnia management. Tea preparation itself often became a mini-ritual. Leaves were carefully measured, water brought to the correct temperature, and steeping times observed with attention. Trays, cups, and spoons were arranged with aesthetic care. In wealthier households, attendants or family members supervised preparation, ensuring consistency and reinforcing the performative aspect of nightly calm. Even in more modest households, small touches, a folded napkin, a carefully poured cup, contributed to the structured, ritualized environment that Victorian culture prized. The sensory qualities of beverages were also exploited. Aromas of chamomile, lavender, or honey encouraged relaxation through olfactory engagement. Warmth and texture provided subtle reassurance to the body, signaling a transition from daytime activity to reflective night. The ritual of holding, sipping, and observing the beverage was as important as the ingredients themselves. Victorian insomnia was a condition in which the body, mind, and environment were harmonized through deliberate attention to multiple sensory cues. Children and adolescents were guided similarly, though with extra caution. Evening nutrition for the young emphasized lightness, warmth, and calm. Small cups of herbal tea or warm milk were served alongside gentle reminders to sit quietly or reflect on the day. Families cultivated the rhythm of evening consumption with consistency, creating early habits of reflective wakefulness, self-restraint, and gentle attentiveness that extended into adulthood. Nutrition became a vehicle for both physiological management and social moral education.